In a world that is against your faith more than ever, Patrick Miller wants to help you choose Jesus over culture. If you need a faith boost, I got a great example of God keeping his promises in the Bible, and Anthony Simone's 80-year quest is marching him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up in episode 106 of Manly with Andy. Now joining the podcast, it's Patrick Miller. I love to start every conversation with the question, what do you think is the biggest challenge men face today, and how do we overcome it?
I think I would say that the biggest problem facing men right now, or a big problem, I don't know what the biggest one is, in my view, a lack of joy. And to be really specific, a lack of play. I think men have been trained to be either cynical about the world, and we don't want to look naive by, not seeing through things, or we've been taught to be too serious. But I mean, look, we've got increasing rates of suicidality, increasing rates of anxiety and depression. And really the only environment where men are allowed to play and show joy is in sporting. And I think sometimes people get the problem inverted. They're like, oh, guys just love sports. And I like to say, no, we've given one context where it's okay for men to be expressive, and that's why they love that context.
That's a really good point. I haven't thought about that. My wife the other day. I love NFL football and playoff. It's the playoff season, and
You and me too. I'm a Chiefs fan. I'm from Kansas City, so I'm living
oh,
my best life the last, almost 10 years?
I know, man. That's I'll pray for you. No, that's good. Good for you. I'm a
What
Vikings
about
fan,
you?
so it's always eternally,
Uh,
like almost there. Bad seasons, then they get your hopes up, and then they crash it down. So that's where I am.
hey, that was being a Chiefs fan for longer than I can
Right.
say, so I'm enjoying this moment while we had it. You had Kirk Cousins, he was a great guy. I don't have him anymore, obviously, but maybe the Vikings day will come soon.
Someday. Well, that's always what you say. There's always next year. But even during the season, I subscribe to NFL Red Zone where you can literally watch every touchdown for the 6 hours of of every Sunday. And my wife, one day she goes, "Honey, you could watch football all day, couldn't you?" And I go, "Yes." And I would like to. So I get
Like,
it. And I'd
are
never put
are
a name.
are you offering, babe? Is this a is
Yeah,
this a is this an
exactly.
opportunity?
Are you just noticing or are you yeah, is this permission? So I get that, and I was just thinking about too, and I saw that you post on Twitter, X, that, you talked about how Ohio State, who just won the national
Yeah.
championship, how their faith is just kind of been intertwined with everything they do, and they did a big old thing on ESPN about that too, which was kinda cool, like, talking about not just, "Hey, give glory to God," on the post interview, but they lived it out.
Yeah, no, I love that story. Now, we beat Ohio State in our bowl last year. I'm a Mizzou fan as well, and they have gone to greater heights, and we have ascended to greater depths. But it was really encouraging hearing the story because I heard some people coming afterwards or before and saying, "Hey, because these teams follow God, that's why they're in the national championship." I thought, well,
Mhm.
you need to read your Bible more closely. There's certainly no guarantee that if you follow Jesus, good things will follow and you'll win championships. But what they said, what Scott Van Pelt said in that interview, which I think was spot on, is that Christianity is beginning to shape the character and the culture of their team in the
Mm,
sense that the guys on that team are less selfish, they're more selfless. And
mm,
no shocker when you're playing a team sport, if you have guys who are selfless, you're going to play at a higher level. But I suspect it goes one step deeper, which is when you feel a sense of safety and security in a group of men, you can accomplish things that you simply cannot accomplish otherwise. And that actually goes back to what I said earlier about play. You can only play when you feel safe. It's
mm,
just a fact. It's why kids are great at playing because they haven't learned how the world hurts them yet.
mm.
It's so they have this amazing ability to turn on imagination and to laugh and to get on the ground and be silly. But you get older and you get hit a few times and you start to realize the cost of opening yourself up and being connected to others. And the result is you can't play because play is a deep act of connection. And so I look at it and I think these are guys who are, I think, connected to Jesus, which then allows them to connect to each other, which then allows them to play. I mean, not just play in general, but play well. And so I do think they're connected. I don't think if the whole team worships Jesus, I mean, you're not going to take a D2 team where everybody's bowing to the Savior and they're going to beat a D1 team by some sort of magical thing that happens. That's not how the
Mm.
world works. And nonetheless, there's something to it.
Mm. Yeah, I know. I think on that quote too, I think maybe from that link that you're posting on ESPN, Scott Van Pelt said this, that he said, both teams prayed to the same God. So what was
Yep.
the difference? And
Yeah.
yeah, to that point. So that was just kind of an aside, but I thought that was kind of funny. So we'll get into your book now here, Joyful Outsiders. Um, And I like that I saw you talk about this too, that you said if you were to summarize the message of joyful outsiders in one slogan, it would be JOMO, the joy of missing out. Why is that?
Well, I think we all have FOMO, the fear of missing out, and it's
Mhm,
natural because as humans, we're wired to be in community. I mean, humans are tribal creatures at our core. And so when there are people off doing things and we're not involved or we don't get to be a part of it, there's something deep down in our biology that says, oh no, I might be left out. And if I'm left out, maybe I'm not going to get the resources I need to be able to live, the food, the stuff that's required for life. And so again, we're hardwired for connection. And that means that when God calls us again and again and again and again in the Bible to be outsiders, to
mm,
be people who don't fit in, it is literally running against the grain of our biology.
mm,
We have to live with so much cognitive dissonance. And I think the only way to do that, to say yes to God's call to be an outsider, is to know that you're saying yes to something greater. And that something greater is joy. In the book of Hebrews, it says that Jesus went to the cross not as an act of duty, although it was, not as an act of submission, although it was. It says, first and foremost, he went to the cross for the joy that was set before him. So when he took up his cross, when he chose his cross, he chose joy. And
mm.
so I think if we want to be outsiders, we have to realize that there really is a joy of missing out. We have to take up our cross and realize I'm not picking the opposite of joy as much as it might feel like it in the moment. I am choosing joy today by being an outsider alongside my outsider king, Jesus.
I thought it was interesting in the first chapter you talk about a Martin Luther King Jr. celebration that shows the tension of being an outsider with a mainstream culture that is against our biblical beliefs. Now, is this something that was this your story?
Yeah.
Okay, wow. And was this kind of the catalyst of figuring out maybe I should write a book about this, or maybe there's a different, a third way that that Jesus would have us go about culture?
Yeah. I mean, this topic of how do we engage our communities and cultures with joy and love, but also resistance, because there's
Mhm,
times that resistance is called for. That's something I've been exploring for a long time. But to be candid, after this event, and I can say what happened. That's when I wrote the introduction to the book. Probably 2 weeks later, that's when I penned the introduction and said, "This is what we need to write about. This is what we need to be talking about." Yeah, so this was probably 2, 3 years ago. Our city, Columbia, Missouri. So background here. Missouri is a red state, so it's conservative, but we live in a college town, so it's very progressive. That
mhm,
means that our community is kind of 50-50. You don't know if the person sitting next to you in church is on the left or the right or whatever else. And so we've had to learn to live with a lot of disagreement in our community. We don't see the world in a single way. But in this January, they were doing this thing called a diversity breakfast where they celebrate the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And to be honest, it's usually pretty germane, normal stuff. We're talking
mhm,
about the civil rights movement. Maybe there'll be a gospel choir there to, sing songs from the civil rights movement. Straightforward stuff. But at this one, they added a new element to it. At the end, they did a drag performance.
mm,
And again, this would have been pretty unnoticeable. I mean, today's culture having a drag performance, so what? That happens all over the place, it seems like. One catch. Our local school district had bused children from middle schools to this diversity breakfast,
mm,
and they did not tell parents ahead of time that there was going to be a drag performance. And so initially, what I expected to have happen was that the school district would issue a mea culpa. Hey, we made a mistake. We should have told you. Maybe they'd say, we didn't realize it. This is on us.
mm,
Instead, what they did was the opposite. They said, we're not changing our field trip policy. We didn't do anything wrong. So as pastors, we're watching. So we're just trying to help people navigate. I mean, what do you do as a parent? Some parents sent angry emails to their principal. Well, the principal has no power over this policy. Other parents sent, more generous emails, trying to win people over. Hey, can we do better? I knew one parent whose kid actually attended the event and he has very severe autism. And that's why he was there because it was a diversity breakfast.
mhm,
And normally he wouldn't be allowed to attend field trips because of his disability. So this was the first time he could go to one, and she was excited. He's going to prove it. He can go on field trips. He can be there with all the other kids. And then she finds out what happened. And because he's nonverbal, she really couldn't talk to him about what occurred there. I mean, what would you do if you're that mom? What would you do if you were a Christian and you were on the school board? Would you speak out in public against the school district? Would you work privately behind the scenes to change things? Would you stay silent? My co-author, I mean, we're just helping people try to navigate this because there's so many. What would you do if you're a teacher and you can't change it, but you're getting angry emails from parents? These are hard things. And
mm.
so my co-author and I, we decided after a lot of prayer, about a week afterwards, when it became apparent that the school district was not going to change, that we would speak out. And this isn't something that we normally do. But we chose to because we thought, man, we need trust between schools and parents. And so we wrote an article that got published in Newsweek about what happened. And rather than railing against drag performances, I mean, for the record, I'm not for drag performances.
Mm,
We tried to take a much more moderate road. And we simply said this: look, in a community as pluralistic and diverse as our own, we cannot expect parents to agree about the kinds of things their kids should see. But what we can agree upon is that parents should have the ability to approve what their kids see. That
mm,
doesn't matter whether it's a field trip to a prayer rally or a field trip to a drag show. Parents have the right to make those choices for kids. And we thought, hey, this is something that we can all agree upon. It's, everybody will say, okay, you know what? That's something we can get behind.
mhm,
The superintendent reaches out to us afterwards. We actually emailed him and told him we were doing this. So we were totally above board. He said, hey, I want to get together with you guys. And so as we're walking in, we had this little piece of paper, we were writing down our goals. And our first goal on the list was to make a friend today.
mm.
And we get in there, and very quickly it became apparent that that goal was not going to be achieved. Because as we sat across the table from him and a school board member who didn't like us very much, and there was no middle ground. Now,
Mm,
in the long run, the policy did end up getting changed because there was so much heat on the school district. But as I reflect on that story, I'm not saying we did the right thing. In fact, I'm not even sure what the right choice was. And
mm.
maybe the right choice changed person to person depending on where they worked, what their influence was, what they could achieve or what they couldn't achieve. And I think that's the kind of approach that we need to our community and culture. It's not a one size fits all solution. I mean, I don't buy one size fits all shirts because it should be called one size fits none. And if that's not good enough for sure, it's like, how could that be good enough for our approach to our community and our culture? And that's what Joyful Outsiders is all about. It's about being an outsider who's full of joy, first of all. And second of all, about having diverse approaches to how we handle challenging events like this inside of our communities.
Yeah, and you have 6 ways to follow Jesus in a confusing culture, 6 different things. I thought that was kinda cool. We can jump into that in a little bit. But you do say early on too, there's a wrong type of outsiders. So
Mm.
what's the right type and what's the wrong type?
Yeah, let's start with the wrong type. When you feel like an outsider, again, you have cognitive dissonance. Your whole body is like, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to feel this way. I don't want to be on the outside at work or in my neighborhood or at my school or with my friends or wherever the environment is. And as a result, you try to relieve the tension that you feel because you're feeling it. I mean, it's raw. And I think there's a few key ways that we do it. The first way is that we just conform. This
Mm,
is one of the most common. I feel out of balance with the world around me. And so rather than resisting it, I just become like it. I'm a chameleon. I take on all of its colors, all of its tastes, all of its norms. I think
mm,
another approach is that we become combative. And that might not sound like a way of relieving tension, but it really is because what the combative person does is they say, I'm going to cow you into agreeing with me. And once you agree with me, then there'll be no tension.
mm,
So one person conforms so there's no tension. The other person makes you conform so that there's no tension. And then I think another approach is maybe the more conflict avoidant approach, which is to say I'm going to cloister myself off from anyone who makes me feel tension. I'm going to try to avoid environments where I feel like I am an outsider. I'm going to try to avoid conversations where I feel like I might be made to feel like an outsider. And why all of these are wrong is because Jesus rejects every single one.
mm,
To the combatant, he says, love your enemies, right? He calls us in his he gets a guy who's a zealot, someone who is violently trying to overthrow Rome, and he calls him to follow him instead of the zealots. He has a different way. And to the person who's a conformist, he says, no, we're supposed to be salt and light. We have to change the world around us, okay? We have to preserve it. And to the person who wants to be conflict avoidant, he says, no, we're a light on a hill. We're Jesus spent so much time with sinners, drunkards, and prostitutes that he was called a glutton and a drunkard himself. We can't just avoid the world and pull out of it. So the problem with all of these isn't that there might not be wisdom in each one in certain circumstances. It's when it becomes your one size fits all solution to how you engage with culture. I only know how to engage by combating. I only know how to engage by conforming. I only know how to engage by avoiding.
so many good things there. Let's jump into this too. One of your chapters, you talk about naming the tension. And I just think, okay, so first off, I don't know if you subscribe to the whole Enneagram thing, but I am definitely an Enneagram 9. I'm a peacemaker, but in my worst times, I'm a conflict avoider. And so even
Yeah.
just saying the word tension is sometimes hard for me to say and do. But you say
Yeah.
that, in your book that we should name the tension. What does that look like?
I think that if you right now feel as though You are more of an outsider today in America than you were 15 years ago.
Mm,
The first thing I want to say is you are not taking crazy pills.
okay.
You are seeing the world rationally. There's been the largest movement of people in American Christian history away from the church. 45 million people have left the church. That's
Mm,
more than joined the church in the first two Great Awakenings and the Billy Graham Crusade. And so for a long time, I thought that's why I feel tension. If I could just go back into the past, then, it'd be the happy good old days when everybody agreed and we're all Christians or whatever. That is not what the tension is. Because the reality is, if I went back to Mississippi in 1955 and
mhm,
preached gospel truth about race and intermarriage, that'd be a
mm,
harder world to live in than the world that I live in right now.
mm,
And so that's the tension that we have to name. Wherever you are, you live in a negative world. There is no positive world in the past or positive world in the present. Wherever you are, we all have to live in this negativity. And the negativity is a liquid fact. It changes in different times and different places. And the word that the Bible has for this is Babylon. Babylon was an ancient empire, and the Bible uses something called metonymy. It's when you use part of a thing to describe a whole. So, like when I say the White House just issued a new executive order, no one listening to this is confused. Not like, wait, houses don't issue
mhm,
orders. What are you talking about? It's a metonymy. You're taking part of the executive branch to apply it to the whole of the executive branch.
mm,
The White House equals the whole executive branch. In the exact same way, Babylon becomes this single example that is then used to describe the entire experience of people living inside of these anti-Eden, anti-kingdom empires that are resistant to God's way. And so that's the tension we have to name, is realizing we live in Babylon. You can love your country, you can be for America, and also have to realize at the exact same time, America is a type of Babylon. This is not the kingdom of God. And once you realize that, that's when you start realizing that's why I have tension, because I've got this kingdom of God operating system over here, and it sees the world in one way, and it defines the world in one way, and it values things in one way. And then there's this America Babylon operating system that sees it a totally different way. And that's why I feel tension, because I'm not in that operating system. I'm over here on my Mac. They're over here on their PC. They're different.
That just makes me think of the story you talk about in your Finding Your Way chapter, the high school football coach who prayed after every game at the 50-yard line, how he ended up kinda losing his job over it, but,
Mhm.
just talking about different ways and I think you can share the story because I don't wanna ruin the surprise that I had heard that I had read that story a few years ago and
Yeah.
didn't really dig deep into it, but you actually said, "Well, hey, your revelation and sharing it was really interesting, so go ahead and share that story."
Yeah, so you're talking about Joe Kennedy. He's the praying football coach. 2015, he made
Mhm,
national news because the superintendent of the school district that he was working in, this is in the Seattle area, so not a very Christian area in general. The superintendent, a guy named Aaron Laval, said that he needed to cease and desist these prayers because he thought that praying after the football game would bring the school district into legal liability for school prayer, which they weren't allowed to do. Joe Kennedy, the coach, he refuses. The next week he goes out there, and the following, and one of the last weeks, you've got people from both sides now coming out to pray with him, and you've got people trying to stop them. I mean, physically obstruct them from getting
mm.
out there. It turns into an all-out prayer brawl, which is probably not the best way to represent Jesus, but it's what happens. And so, people hear the story, and maybe you like Joe Kennedy, maybe you don't. Here's the thing they don't hear: Aaron Laval, the superintendent, he went to the same church as Joe Kennedy.
Hmm.
Yeah, like, that had to be an awkward moment in the urinal. I mean, what do you do when you're sitting down the aisle from someone who's saying, "Hey, you need to stop?" And this gets even crazier because both of these men could defend their perspective biblically.
Mhm,
Aaron Laval, the superintendent, could say, "Look, Jesus was clear. He said, 'Don't go into the streets and pray in public like the hypocrites.'" This is in Matthew 6 or 5, I think. He said, "No, go into your prayer closet and pray in private." Why are you out there praying in public, Joe Kennedy? He could also point to the SBC, which, when school prayer was banned in the United States, celebrated it and said, "We don't want our schools teaching people how to pray. They don't know how to pray. We don't want that." Or you could have Joe Kennedy say, "But what about me?" I mean, Jesus also said that if you were ashamed of him before the world, then he would be ashamed of you before the Father. And I'm not ashamed of Jesus. He would say, "Look, we need to protest what's wrong. There's nothing wrong with doing a prayer of thanks quietly after a football game. What's wrong about this?" The sad reality is they obviously never came into reconciliation. They never saw each other's side. But I think it's a microcosm of what happens in a lot of churches, where you get some people who are on the cultivate side. They're like Aaron Laval. We need to cultivate this place. We need to be for the sake and the welfare of our city. And then you've got people in the Joe Kennedy camp, right? The resistors, like, no, we need to say no, we need to resist. And the problem is that the Bible doesn't give us an either or here. The
Mm,
Bible gives us a both and. It says you need to push hard in both directions. You must be a cultivator and a resistor. You don't want to go halfway on either, go full in on both. And that creates tension. But here's the thing, tension creates creativity.
mm,
There is no creativity without tension. And that's what happens when we push hard in both directions. I mean, we've seen this so much in our own church. We push hard in both of those directions, and the result is creativity and
mm.
shock and surprise and delight.
I like that. Tension creates creativity. Let's do this. Let's go because you kind of mentioned it there. The 6 ways to follow Jesus in a confusing culture. You kind of talked about 2 of the different profiles, or I don't know if you call them profiles or what, but unpack those here for the last little bit of our interview because
Mhm.
I think I would be more because I'm also firstborn rule follower. I'd probably be more like the superintendent in that last story of, all right, here's the rules. We're going to live within the rules. We're going to honor that, but we're going to find other ways to share Jesus. And I wouldn't be the guy that'd be like, I'm praying at the 50-yard line and people can come fight me for it. So, but we don't have to be, we don't have to like just say that, oh well, I can't do that, so I'm not a good Christian, right?
Yeah, we're not all thumbs.
Mm,
Paul uses the metaphor of a body to talk about spiritual gifts, but I think the same thing applies to our cultural engagement. If you feel like you can't hold those tensions of cultivation and resistance in your individual life, I have wonderful news for you. You were never called to hold it in your individual life.
mm,
We, as the body, hold the tension. So, you, if you're a cultivator, man, it is really good to be able to love and encourage the resistors because you need them and they need you. And it's only a body that has both that can do its whole job. And
mm,
so we've taken the biblical story of exile in particular and divided it up into 6 different ways to follow God in a disorienting culture, partially because there's so many books out there on, cultural engagement or changing your community or changing the world. And like, if you're anything like me, you kind of get a little cynical and exhausted by it. Like, man, I'm never going to change the world. And, this stuff's all philosophical. You could fill the Grand Canyon with books like that. Our primary goal was to be practical and to give people a particular framework that they could use in their lives to change their community, their local space that they live in, and understand that it might be different than someone else.
mm,
So, you have people who we call the trainer. These are people who change the world by changing people's habits. These are your disciplers. These are people who are helping people, spend time in prayer and in the Bible and fasting and bringing spiritual discipline into their lives. And they're so important because here's the thing, you cannot change the world if you don't have virtuous people. You can't have virtuous people unless their hearts are transformed by the means of grace God has given us to change us.
mm,
Right. And so they're saying, look, I change the world by changing people. Okay. Now you can go to a very different extreme. You can find people who we call the protester. These are people who change the world by challenging injustice. They don't sit down, they don't stay quiet when there's problems.
mm,
Martin Luther King would be an example of that. You could find countless in the Bible, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When Nebuchadnezzar builds his golden statue, they don't worship it. Everybody else is getting down their knees and they're sitting there standing.
mm,
Well, that's an act of protest. And we do need to challenge injustice sometimes. Another approach is what we call the advisor. These are people who change the world by influencing the influential. And so someone like Aaron Laval might really fall into that category. These are people who work on the inside of institutions, which means they have to be okay with the gray. They're
mm,
okay with proximate goods. They know, look, you might not get everything you want, but if we can bend things towards what's good, that's better than leaving them bent towards the bad.
mm,
Daniel was a great example of this. I mean, he had to say, long live King Nebuchadnezzar. Here's the guy who, literally, murdered his family, destroyed his city. And he's saying, long live this guy. And you know that Nebuchadnezzar made choices that he disagreed with.
mm,
And we know that sometimes he challenged Nebuchadnezzar. He said, hey, your pride's going to get you in trouble here, man. And yet he clearly didn't get in this black and white mode where he had an all or nothing attitude. Either Nebuchadnezzar, you follow Yahweh and do it his way, or I'm out.
mm,
He was an advisor. And we need advisors. These people get called corrupt or, maybe they don't resist. I'm like, no, you need those people and institutions to change them. You also have artists, people who change the world by creating beauty. You have builders who change the world by building institutions and businesses. Huge part of changing the world is our businesses and our nonprofits. And then you also have our ambassadors, people who change the world by changing hearts. This is particularly evangelism, right? So people who say, look, you can't change the world around you if people aren't following Jesus. And so it's kind of hard to give these big overviews. You're like, oh
mm.
man, I'd like to hear more. But that's what the goal of the book was to give historical and biblical examples of each of these different ways, and then practical tips and guides for how you can find your way and then live it out in your life.
What's the one thing that you would want people to know? How can they become joyful outsiders? What's that first step?
I think the one thing I want people to know is how you get the joy of being an outsider. What's that even entail? And I think the key is knowing the promises that God gives to those who join Jesus on the outside,
Mm,
who bear the reproach alongside him. There was a tightrope walker. His name was Charles Blondin, and this is the 1800s. He was the first person to attempt tightrope walking across the Niagara Falls. And this huge crowd gathers to see him do it. According to news reports, they all thought he was going to die. Like someone said, oh, he's going to get blasted to atoms, which I think is an awesome way to describe someone's perishing off a tightrope. That's what they're all expecting. And so
right.
he goes across this rope. There's 70-mile-an-hour winds. It's crazy. He gets halfway across. He sits down, gets back up, and then finishes the tightrope. And for the next 2 weeks, he keeps doing more stunts. He does it backwards. He does it with a bag over his head. He takes one of those old-timey 1800 cameras. He takes a picture of the crowd. And so, I mean, they think this guy can do anything. And finally gets in front of the crowd and he says, okay, do you guys think I can do anything? And they say, yeah, absolutely, you can do it. He says, okay, one of you volunteer to get on my back.
Mm.
The crowd goes silent, except for one guy, a guy named Harry Colcord. He raises his hand. He clambers up onto Charles Blondin's back. They begin their journey across the rope. About halfway, because the rope wasn't designed for that much weight, the guy wires start to snap.
Mm.
And this thing's swaying wildly in the wind. And Charles Blondin says to Harry Colcord, Harry, don't try to balance yourself. Don't try to do this on your own. Now, you and I, we are one. When I lean, you lean. When I sway, you sway. If you don't, we perish. Then they make it to the other side of the rope. When I think about what it means to be a joyful outsider, it's like watching Jesus walk on this tightrope through death and coming out the other side alive and thinking, oh my gosh, this guy can do anything. This is amazing. I mean, he died and he came back to life and now he's promising it to everyone else. And he keeps doing these amazing things in our life. Like, oh, wow, truly, there's nothing that could stop him. And he says, okay, who wants to get onto my back? Who wants to walk on the tension with me? Who wants to be on this knife's edge? And very few people raise their hands because we like cheering for Jesus from the sidelines. We don't like getting inside the game with him. But for those who do, for those who climb up onto his back and experience the terror of hanging over the Niagara Falls, well, those are the people who get what no one else gets. Him saying, let's be one. When I sway, you sway. When I lean, you lean. We perish if we don't do this together. There is a joy in his presence that you cannot get anywhere else, but it's a joy he offers only to those who become outsiders like him.
Now taking a look at the Bible, picking it up in Joshua 21, verse 43. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had solemnly promised their ancestors. None of their enemies could stand against them, for the Lord helped them conquer all their enemies. Not a single one of all the good promises the Lord had given to the family of Israel was left unfulfilled. Everything he had spoken came true. So this is one of the most powerful truths in the Bible. God always delivers. And if you think about the story we've been talking about, the Israelites went into a land with so many enemies that when they first were supposed to go to the promised land, the spies that came back said, no way, there's too many. They're all big. We'll be overwhelmed. When they were finally given it to them, then they had to start getting to work. But God was there. And actually, it starts before that. These promises started with Abraham hundreds of years earlier through slavery in Egypt, then wandering in the wilderness, and then the battles. And it might have felt like multiple times, God, this is never going to finish. This is never going to happen. But God kept every single word. And so for you, God's timeline might not match yours. It usually never does. Waiting is tough, but his promises are never empty. If he says he'll do it, you can take that to the bank. Whether it's peace in the chaos, strength for the journey, or hope for the future, God doesn't leave anything unfinished. Now entering the Hall of Heroes, Anthony Simone. At just 16 years old, Anthony left high school to help support his family during the Great Depression. A year later, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and fought bravely in World War II, including the Battle of the Bulge. Returning home after the war, Anthony earned his GED, but the formal recognition of a high school diploma remained a missing chapter in his extraordinary life. That was until Anthony's granddaughter, a teacher, decided to honor her grandfather's sacrifices and arranged for him to receive an official diploma from Cranston High School East. In a touching ceremony, Anthony was celebrated not just for his academic milestone, but for his lifetime of service and dedication. So because Anthony Simone put family and country before himself and proves you're never too old to follow your dreams, he is officially in the Manly with Andy Hall of Heroes. He traveled around the world in a backpack, and Kevin Chandler's story is an incredible example of true friendship. Taking a look at the Bible, Joshua gives a roadmap for a life of faith, and Bob Williams' sweet mission is unwrapping him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up next time on Manly with Andy.